So, there's many things in medicine that they don't tell people about. Um, and you wouldn't necessarily know about them even if you were in medicine yourself. I've kind of gone way beyond the normal curriculum to be able to find out some things um, that affect people's health naturally. So I'm just going to share some of them with you. I'm sorry, I don't know anybody's names, but you raised your hand, and so go right ahead.
Developing such some craziness about my body, but I was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, and no one knew how this happened, where it come from. I was, just struck me like that. But came to find out, I went to a dentist, and he says, how long have you had these fillings in your mouth? And I told him, I said, well, when I went into military, that's what they gave us, and I've had them in there more than 20 years. They have been there. He says, well, we're going to start taking them out. And as he started to take them out, I still have some more to take out because it's costly and it's very costly. But again, but it's so important to get them out. But I feel so much better, and I haven't had any episodes with the myasthenia gravis at all.
Wonderful.
Since I've started to do that. So very important.
Wonderful. Well, people don't know about this, and their regular medical doctors are not going to tell them because they themselves don't know. I mean, we did head and neck part of anatomy class with the dental students, so we shared some of the same, teachings that they were telling the dental students, they were telling us, but they weren't telling us this. So I'm convinced that this is actually a hidden cause of cancer. My mother actually died of ovarian cancer when she was 57, and she had very good lifestyle habits, but she had a mouthful of mercury. And, when I was younger, I had a mouthful of mercury also. And here's a tip.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I have a tendency to speak quietly, so if I do that, then just let me know.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'm convinced that the mercury fillings were a reason why she developed the cancer, because she didn't really have any other reasons to. Um, and also just add, it's important to try to get your fillings, if you have them, if you have mercury fillings, replaced by a biological or mercury-free or holistic dentist, because since the American Dental Association never admitted that putting mercury fillings in people's mouths was harmful, they didn't teach all of their graduates the special protocols for removing them in the safest possible way. So most people don't know that there are two different types of dentists, the regular kind and the holistic kind.
I never
But the
knew that.
holistic kind have actually been ones that went out of their way to take special training in how to reduce the possibility that more dental amalgam is going to be spilled into a person's mouth in the process of replacing it. So that can still happen even with a holistic dentist, but the odds are much likelier that it won't, or that it won't as much, because they've learned the proper procedures to how to mitigate the potential spillage of this stuff into the person's system. So I know that it can be an expensive process, and some people get discouraged and turned off because of that. But you know, you can't let that discourage you. And even if you just do a little bit at a time, let's say you have 20 fillings and you do, one a year or two a year, within a number of years, you'll really have reduced your risk for a lot of bad things by quite a bit. So it's definitely worth the investment. And it makes more sense to try to really maximize your health if you're not carrying around toxins in your mouth all the time. That's just one source of inflammation. There are others. There are things that people can do to reduce inflammation in general. So another potential source of inflammation is eating foods that one is sensitive to or allergic to. Conventional doctors don't really consider the possibility that a person's symptoms may come from allergies that much. So there's certain types of allergies where if a person has those symptoms, the person might be thinking that it's due to allergies, and the doctor might be thinking that it's due to allergies. So if, for example, they have, itching all over, swelling up, breaking out in hives, runny nose, watery eyes, sneezing, coughing, then they may think, yes, I might have allergies. And if they tell those symptoms to a doctor, the doctor might also think, maybe I ought to test this patient for allergies. But that's just one type of allergy. There's other kinds that tend to cause different symptoms. So, and these kinds tend to be more common than the symptoms, than the kind that produce the symptoms that I just mentioned. So, for example, other kinds of allergies can cause joint pain, fatigue, headache, any kind of gastrointestinal or digestive symptom, tendencies to gain weight, brain fog, all kinds of things that you might not normally think of, excuse me, being from allergies can be from allergies. And one of the most common types of allergies is gluten sensitivity. And more people are discovering that they're sensitive to gluten. So, gluten is a sticky protein that's found in certain grains, most notably wheat. Sorry, a little dehydrated there, but anyway. It's okay. So, we're often taught to eat heart healthy whole grains. Eating whole grains is supposed to be good for our heart, but it depends on which whole grains you're eating, and it also depends on if you're sensitive to them. I'd be willing to say that most people who have type 2 diabetes are sensitive to sugar and they're sensitive to gluten. They may also be sensitive to dairy. And by the way, just to tie in what I was previously saying, mercury toxicity will actually exacerbate sensitivities to gluten, sugar, and dairy. So, eating wheat is actually not good for your heart. It's really not. And if you want to read an interesting book about this that was written by a cardiologist, exactly, this gentleman is very well informed. Yes, Wheat Belly, written by a cardiologist, and he talks about the effects of taking his patients off of gluten and how that improves their lipid profile. So a lot of times when patients have elevated cholesterol, their doctor will tell them, oh, you need to stop eating so much red meat. Well, the red meat is not so much the issue. And it's actually not what you're eating in your diet that actually raises your cholesterol so much. Only 10% of the cholesterol that's in your blood is coming from your diet. The other 90% is coming from the way that your liver is functioning. And one of the things that the liver deals with is it helps to determine which things the body considers to be part of it and which things it considers to be invading aliens that it needs to like protect against by causing allergic reactions. So, even oats, which are said to be very healthy, I'm not clear yet really about whether oats contain gluten. I've heard that they do, I've heard that they don't. But I do know that there are a lot of people who are sensitive to oats and they may not know that. And so, when you're told to eat oatmeal, that it's good for your heart, it may not be good for your heart at all. Um, and, even oats that are sold as gluten free may not actually be good for people because they may be sensitive to the oats themselves, whether or not they contain gluten. So, there are grains that don't contain gluten. Rice doesn't contain gluten, and corn doesn't contain gluten, although corn is not a very good, you know, uh, source of nutrients, and it can also cause allergies as well. So inflammation causes allergies, and there's many things that people could be eating, mainly gluten, sugar, dairy, possibly oats and corn, that can also be causing them inflammation. And getting these things out of the diet or minimizing them can reduce inflammation. Also, the kinds of oils that people are eating. So, for example, in America, we're eating mostly omega-6 fats. That's what comes in most of the food that we're getting and in vegetable oils. But there's other kinds of fats that are much better and important for our health overall. For example, fish oils, very important at reducing inflammation, at improving circulation, and there's other kinds of oils, such as what's found in avocados or olives or olive oil, which is monounsaturated fatty acids, very heart healthy, very good for you overall. I mean, I think the Mediterranean diet that is high in fish and olives and olive oil, has been shown to be anti-cancer and anti-heart disease. And, a lot of the things that people have problems with, like arthritis, anytime you hear arthritis or itis, it usually means that something is inflamed. So if you have appendicitis, you've got inflammation of your appendix. Um, and a lot of times these things can be avoided by proper diet, adequate hydration. People should be drinking half their body weight in water a day. So if you want to do the math, which I'm not good at, you can think of your weight in pounds and then take half of that. That would be how much you should be drinking in ounces. And then if you want to, you can divide that by 8, which would be how many 8-ounce glasses that would be. So let's say for a person who weighs 160 pounds, half of that would be 80, and then divided by 8, they should be drinking at least 10 glasses of water a day. Yes, and that will do many good things because whatever your body weight is, divide it in half and then divide that by 8, and that's how many 8-ounce glasses of water you should be drinking a day. Yes, sure.
I know that I was drinking, like I said, this is not a holistic doctor or anything like that, but um, at a point, I think I was drinking too much water, and I don't know if there's a such thing, but I was I was told that I was probably flushing out all of my good cells or something. Because when I drink a lot of water, and I was making sure I drank almost 10 to 12 glasses of water a day, I was in the bathroom consistently.
Well, how much you drink and how much you pee can be not necessarily that related. People always think that they are, but there's other factors going on that may cause a person who doesn't even drink that much to have to urinate frequently, or cause a person who even does drink a lot not necessarily have to urinate frequently. It partly depends on their kidney function. Thank you. It partly depends on their kidney function, and it partly depends on intake of other things like essential fatty acids. So essential fatty acids are the building blocks and the repair ingredients to your cell membranes. And your cell membranes are what determines what gets let into the cell and what gets kept out of the cell. So in the device that I use, the quantum biofeedback device, one of the things that is measured, there's certain things that are measured every time I see a person on there, and one of them is their degree of hydration. So that should be between 80 and 100. I've actually never seen anybody come in, never, and I've been using this device now for 20 years. I've never seen anybody come in with hydration over 100. I've seen many people come in with hydration under 80, but I haven't seen it to be over 100. So although I actually heard of a case in the news just recently of a woman who supposedly drank too much in too short a period of time and wound up dying that way, but you know, this is not something that's easy to do. It's not easy to drink too much water.
Okay.
And
Too
the
much.
reason why you might be going frequently, it might be that you might have some degree of bladder inflammation. If you have bladder inflammation, then even though your bladder may not be very full, but you may feel like you need to go, or it may be that you're not taking in enough um, essential fatty acids, and therefore your cellular membranes are not letting the water into your cells. See, there's various different spaces in the body. There's the intravascular space where the water, goes. There's also the intracellular space, and then there's the interstitial space, which is the space between the cells. So water can go in various different places. And how much you're going to the bathroom doesn't necessarily correlate directly with how much water you're drinking. Most of the time, people are dehydrated, and that's part of what makes them feel more tired. It can also be part of what makes them feel more hungry, because a lot of times when people are hungry, they really are thirsty, but they're getting their signals mixed up. So there's a very interesting book about that called Your Body's Many Cries for Water, and there's all kinds of symptoms that either come about or get worse when a person's dehydrated. So, for example, allergies are worse when a person's dehydrated. So, when a person's dehydrated, their body makes more histamine, which is an allergic response. That's why people sometimes take over the counter medications, antihistamines, to help control their allergic symptoms, but maybe some of their symptoms wouldn't be so bad to begin with if they were adequately hydrated. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about two things, cow milk and the importance of Celtic salt. The effect cow milk have on the effect cow milk have on our body as humans, and the importance of using Celtic salt versus iodine.
Well, those are two very good questions, and I'm not so sure that I'll be able to give you a great answer to the second one, but let me at least take on the first one, and that is to say that most of the time, in most places, people don't really need to drink cow's milk. A lot of times they're told that they do need to drink it because they're told that this is a really good source of calcium, and that if you're not getting your dairy, then you're not getting enough calcium. Well, the reason why that's not necessarily true is that even though dairy products do contain a lot of calcium, but it's not as well absorbed um, as, for example, dark green leafy vegetables, which also contain a lot of calcium and are much better absorbed. The other thing is, a lot of people are sensitive to dairy. They may not always know it because they may not have a classical allergic response, but they could still get other things like sinus congestion, like constipation, when they eat dairy. However, remember also that the dairy that we're consuming now is not the original dairy. So when people were growing up on farms, they would milk their cows and they would be drinking raw milk, unpasteurized, unhomogenized, and full of enzymes. Nowadays, they're drinking milk that has been heated to a certain temperature and where the cream has been evenly distributed throughout the milk by homogenization. And so this is kind of a different product that's not really equivalent to what we're mostly drinking. Most of the time, people don't need to be drinking anything but human milk. However, that being said, there are actually some places in Africa. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with the Maasai, but the Maasai, they drink cow's milk. They also drink their cow's blood, and there are, Arabic countries where they drink camel's milk, but they consume it in an unprocessed way, and it doesn't harm their health the way that regular commercial dairy tends to harm people's health over here. About the Celtic salt, I really don't know enough about that to comment. The only thing that I can say is that as far as I know, Celtic salt doesn't contain iodine, and iodine is one of the important nutrients that our bodies need and can't manufacture on its own. I just want to say something about the way that food is being raised now, because, you brought up the point of iodine, and that's a very good point to consider because we need iodine to make our thyroid hormones. Our thyroid hormones contain iodine. And so you can get iodine from seafood and you can get iodine from iodized salt, but there are places in the country where people don't eat much seafood and they're not really going to get the iodine from their food. And just to tell you about what's gone on with agriculture in this country, starting from back in the 1940s, instead of farming the way that people had farmed for generations prior to that, where you harvest the crops and then you return the parts of the crops that you're not going to use to the ground. So what this does is it revitalizes the soil. The soil is supposed to have something like 60 trace minerals in it. And when the roots of the plants, of the crops, take up those nutrients and then those crops are harvested, in the modern day way of agriculture, they do not return these nutrients to the ground. So with each successive crop, the soil becomes poorer and poorer, and the crop becomes more and more prone to insect pests because the plants don't get the kind of nutrition that they would really need to be able to repel those pests. And what they do in commercial agriculture is that they put back 3 minerals into the soil, because without these minerals, plants just won't grow. So they put back potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And if you go to, let's say, Home Depot and you buy a bag of fertilizer, you're going to see 3 numbers on that bag. And those 3 numbers are going to tell you the ratio of those 3 minerals that are in there. But what about the other 57? So you have some very important minerals, and even though they're only needed in the diet as a trace, but they're really important. So I'm going to tell you some of them, and then you can think about what lack of these minerals will do. So one very important one is selenium, very important for thyroid function, for vision, and also for immune system power. Another one that's very important is zinc, very important for blood sugar regulation and, endocrine function. Iodine we mentioned already, but vanadium, very important for blood sugar regulation, and you can buy it as a supplement called vanadyl sulfate. Chromium, very important for blood sugar regulation. So back in the 1940s, a soil scientist appeared before Congress and said, if you continue to grow foods in the way that you've started to grow them, in other words, changing the style of agriculture from what was basically organic to the commercial farming mechanisms, he said within about 20 years, you're going to have a lot more people with diabetes and a lot more people who are overweight. And they said, thank you very much for your report. And they shelved it. And they continued to do what they were doing. And sure enough, much more diabetes, much more obesity, much more cancer. And while at the same time they were doing this to the way that foods are being grown, but they were also basically gaslighting people and saying that, there is no significant difference between GMO organisms, genetically modified, and ones that are natural, which is really not true, because the ones that were genetically modified, the thought behind it supposedly was that if we could make seeds that are more pest resistant naturally, then we wouldn't have to use so much pesticides. However, that turned out not to be the case. So GMO things, like for example, all of the wheat, all of the corn, and all of the soy, that's grown in the United States, unless it's sold as organic, it will be GMO. And by GMO, that means that even in the seed, right there in the seed, is the herbicide called Roundup. Okay?
Which Roundup has been also.
Yes, Roundup has been shown to cause cancer
Yeah.
in the seed, in the very seed itself. And the way that they were able to, cut and splice the genomes of these things to make them genetically modified, they did that with viruses. So viruses,
What is virus?
viruses,
Virus.
viruses,
Okay.
yes. So, most people don't know this. And then again, too, the way that they harvest the plants, also, they use Roundup to dry the crops out so that they are easier to harvest. So you have the poison right within the seed, and then they found that you actually had to apply more of the herbicides to be able to get crops, even though supposedly you wouldn't have to with the GMO stuff. And then they're also using it as a desiccant to dry out the crops to make it easier to harvest them. So there are tests actually that can determine how much glyphosate, which is another name for Roundup, a person has absorbed. But the thing about it is conventional doctors are never going to order those tests, even though they exist. And so-called health insurance companies wouldn't pay for that testing to be done, even if the doctors were willing to order it. So there's many things that affect people nowadays that they do not know affects them. And, one of the consequences of eating food that has been sprayed with herbicides and pesticides is that there are certain chemicals that are perceived by the body as being foreign estrogens. So herbicides, pesticides, and plastics are all seen by the body as being foreign estrogens. And this is the reason why, and even for example, conventionally grown beef, it's injected with recombinant bovine growth hormone so that the cows can gain weight quicker and be brought to slaughter quicker. So that makes them gain weight quicker. It also makes the people who eat their meat gain weight quicker too. But they don't mention that. Um, and, when you have too much estrogen in your system, it will tend to cause you, tendencies to gain weight, have heart disease, have liver problems, and other kinds of issues. So there's a lot of hormonal imbalance going on in America. That happens to be one of my hot button topics. I'm very fascinated by hormones and their balance and what that will do to people's health when it's in balance or when it's out of balance. But, there are a lot of other countries in the world that have much higher standards for their food than the United States. And sometimes the United States tries to force these companies to take the United States' inferior exports, by using financial leverage on them, and saying, well, we won't trade with you if you don't, take a certain amount of our beef, or a certain amount of, telling Mexico that it has to take bioengineered corn. The problem also with these things is that unlike the old time farming where you grew a crop, the crop made seeds, you harvested the seeds, and then you used the seeds to make your next crop. With these GMO plants, they don't have viable seeds. So you have to keep going back to Monsanto, now Bayer, to have to keep purchasing more seeds. And this is like causing all kinds of havoc around the world with farmers who are no longer able to feed their families. You don't hear about that this much over here, but in Africa and in India, some farmers were actually committing suicide because they didn't see any way to feed their families. And, it's very sad, because they were basically deceived. They were told, well, if you get these GMO seeds, then you're going to produce a lot more crops. But what they weren't told was, yeah, well, once you've produced one growth of crops, you're going to have to keep coming back to us to buy more seed. So, the other thing about it too is that the soil is alive. It has earthworms and ants and all kinds of things in it that help turn it over and aerate it and produce the proper environment for plants to grow. If you remove the nutrients from the soil and you poison the soil so that these kinds of organisms can't live there, then whatever crops are produced are not going to be as healthy. And they may look exactly the same. You could take an ear of corn that's organic and an ear of corn that's GMO. It may look the same, but even animals can tell the difference. So they've done interesting experiments where they had sacks of grain in a warehouse. Some of those sacks of grain were all organic, and others of those sacks of grains were the conventionally raised GMO sacks. And when rats got into the barn, they only ate the organic stuff because they could smell the difference and they knew what was good for them. But unfortunately, people mostly go by how it looks and maybe how it tastes. But I'll tell you, an interesting thing about organic food is that it actually is much more flavorful, and tastes better. So that's the little extra thing that you get for paying more for it, is it's also healthier. But if you eat less processed food, then you will find that the gap in expense between, you know, uh, organic food and, your GMO conventional food is a lot less, because really the profit is in the processing. So if you go buy, a frozen dinner or something, the ingredients that it took to make that were actually very cheap, but the labor and the machinery that it took to process that, that's really what you're paying for. So, sometimes people say, it's too expensive to eat organic. Anybody can go to the store and buy a sack of organic carrots, a bag of organic apples, and it's not going to cost them that much money because these things are unprocessed. And they're so much healthier if everybody even just ate like one apple, one orange, one carrot, one rib of celery a day. That's just 4 items. And yet, it would make such a huge difference in their health if they ate those 4 things organic every day. Even if they didn't eat anything else that was organic, it would make a big difference in their health overall. So I think
Celery,
apple, celery, oranges,
oranges,
um, let's see, carrots.
carrot, apple.
Carrots, yeah, carrots have vitamin A, which is great for your immune system and great for your eyesight. And all of these things will give you fiber, which will help keep your bowels regular. Doctors don't usually tell patients what they can do to avoid cancer. Every now and then you have some kind of publicity event, like, in October, it's coming up. They're going to make a big hoopla about how women should have mammograms, and they're going to promote Cancer Awareness Month. Well, I would much rather have cancer avoidance all year than Cancer Awareness Month, because who really wants to get early detection of cancer and then get cured? Wouldn't it be nicer not to ever have cancer at all? I think it would be, and it's very avoidable. So if people will avoid doing things that, well, trying to keep one's body weight to a healthy, healthy weight for their height is very important. Oftentimes, they're not told how to do this. They may be told to lose weight, but they're not told how to do it, or at least they're not told in any way that actually works. So if you would like to read an interesting book about that, I highly recommend one called The Obesity Code, written by Dr. Jason Fung. And he talks about practical ways to lose weight and keep it off, because the losing weight itself is not as difficult as losing weight and keeping it off. because there are many diets that can help people to lose weight while they follow them for maybe about 6 months. And then, oftentimes, even if they're still following the diet, they will gradually tend to gain back the weight. So he talks in that book about what causes this. And I think it's really great because, I think if everybody knew this, there'd be no reason why people really have to, suffer with overweight or diabetes or even hypertension. So many of the things that go along with, weighing more. Yes. Yes. Dr. Jason Fung, Fung. He was actually a kidney specialist who was helping his patients, many of whom who had diabetes, avoid further decline in their kidney function by managing them with diet. And he told them different things than what are generally told to people, such as that just reducing your calorie count is going to make you lose weight, not necessarily. All sorts of other strategies that we've all heard about are not necessarily going to be successful in the long run. But what this gentleman was talking about here earlier in terms of fasting, he gets into that and he describes how intermittent fasting, and it could be just as, as little as like eating 1 or 2 meals a day instead of eating 3 plus snacks. If you don't snack and if you just eat 1 or 2 meals a day and eat it early in the day, because you see, it's not just what you eat and how much you eat, but when you eat it that counts. The same amount of food could tend to hang on you and your weight could increase if you eat it just before you go to bed. But if you have that food in the morning or in the middle of the day and you don't eat again after that, you will find that you will have a tendency to either maintain or lose weight, even though it's the same amount of food. So we evolved as human beings in times when you couldn't just stroll on over to your refrigerator and grab something out of there whenever you wanted to. You might have to hunt for it, you might have to cultivate it, and there may be times when food would be scarce. So our bodies adapted to that. We wouldn't want to starve every time there's kind of a drought, So our bodies have arranged it so that we try to maintain a set point in our weight, no matter whether we're having more food or less food. And he describes, the mechanics of this really beautifully, and he lists a whole lot of studies that are very convincing. But, the sad part is that even though this information is out there, and even though, for example, wheat belly has been out there for, I'm going to say, at least 7 to 10 years, it's not changing the kind of recommendations that doctors are giving to their patients. So one of the things that actually made me stop going to the hospital to see patients was one day when I had admitted 2 people who did not know that they had diabetes, but who were coming to the hospital for problems that were being caused by their diabetes. And I went to visit them the next morning, and I saw that one of them had some stuff on their tray that I thought was a mistake. He was given pancakes, he was given a banana, and he was given some kind of artificial syrup. So I checked the name tag on his tray thinking that maybe somebody had made a mistake and delivered him the wrong tray. But sure enough, it had his name on it. So I called down to dietary and said, hey, what is this? This is not the diet that I ordered for this patient. And they said, yes, well, we know, but the diet that you ordered didn't conform to the American Diabetic Association standards, so therefore we couldn't give the patient that. And then when I was getting ready to discharge the patients and I was getting up from the nursing station to go over and talk to them about what they should and shouldn't be eating now that they know that they're diabetic, a nurse asked me what I was doing. And I said, oh, I'm going to go over and talk to the patient and tell them what they should be doing. And she said, what are you doing? She said, none of the other doctors do that. They leave that to the nurses. So I thought to myself, you know what? I'm actually much better off staying outside the hospital where I can control the messaging that, I'm giving my patients than attending people in here where I'm trying to do one thing with one hand and they're doing completely the opposite with the other hand. So it's sad because this information has been out there for a while. If you want to read another great book, I would recommend the one called Grain Brain. Grain Brain was written by a neurologist, and he talks about the bad effects that grains can have on the brain. See, a lot of times when people hear about, let's say, gluten sensitivity, they're thinking about things that relate to their digestion. But if a person has gluten sensitivity, that can affect their brain and nerves as much as it affects their digestion, because there can be an allergic response. Though there are antigens on the brain and nerves that can cross-react with antibodies to gluten. So when a person eats gluten, if they're sensitive to it, that can give them problems with their brain and nerves. And I would be willing to bet you that many of the people who are currently dealing with Alzheimer's didn't necessarily have to have that. It's not necessarily genetic with them. It has a lot to do with their lifestyle and their environment. And I was just hearing recently that a lot of African Americans suffer more prevalently from Alzheimer's than Caucasians do. But I'm thinking, in Africa, we didn't really eat so much wheat. I mean, there were places that did make wheat and bread. Egypt was a place that invented like bread making, but most of Africa wasn't eating bread, and they weren't eating cereal made from wheat. Yes.
Of all the legacy institutions that you may not have mentioned by name, but I'm thinking the FDA, the Allopathic Medical Society with all their systems, you've got Big Pharma, you've got managed care, and you have all these systems that are really stacked up for you not to win as the individual. So as a society and as an individual responsible for other people's health, what do you recommend outside of the things that you've been saying? How to eat and how to protect yourself. But outside of that, when we do have these legacy institutions telling us how we should live our lives, how do we live? How do you live in a healthy way?
Well, I've often been asked by my patients, why do you think so differently than most of your colleagues? What is it that makes you think very differently than most of them? And most of the time I answer to that the reason why I do is because both of my parents were journalists. So they taught me how to analyze information, read between the lines, and consider whose benefit it is that I'm being presented with this information. A lot of times the people that I saw in medical school and residency was just believing everything that they said, hook, line, and sinker. And you just don't even know the forces that are arrayed against being healthy in this country. I'm going to tell you something that some of you may have a hard time believing, but many people have said, well, when are they going to develop a cure for cancer?
Not going to happen.
A cure for cancer, a non-toxic cure for cancer, was developed back in the 1930s. By a medical doctor named Dr. Royal Rife. And I only got to find out about this because when I was attending acupuncture school, I saw one of my classmates walking around with this book that was entitled The Cure for Cancer Suppressed, The Life and Work of Dr. Royal Rife. Well, since my mother had died of ovarian cancer, I was very interested in reading that book, so I asked him if he would lend it to me when he was done with it, and he did. So I got to find out how this doctor was so brilliant. He invented microscopes that could magnify the organisms that were causing cancer so much that you didn't have to kill them by staining them with dye. You could see them multiplying under the microscope. And then he discovered frequencies of light that if you shone it on these organisms, it would cause them to vibrate so fast that they would fly apart. I'm sure most people have heard of the idea of if you hit the resonant frequency of a glass, it might shatter. There used to be an old commercial. I don't know if y'all are old enough to remember this, but there used to be a commercial where they would say, "Is it live or is it Memorex?" And they would have Ella Fitzgerald holding a glass, and she would hit a high C and the glass would shatter. And then supposedly the Memorex could produce the same effect, this tape. But what genius it was for him to do this. And he was curing people that were said to be incurable, that were terminal. Well, one day, the guy who was co-head of the AMA, the American Medical Association, showed up on his doorstep and said, "Hey, we've heard about this work you've been doing. It's wonderful, but you need to cut us in for 50%. And he said, "Well, I can't do that." And he said, "Well, fine, then don't. We'll just ruin you." So they broke into his offices in the middle of the night, stole his microscopes, stole his case files, and basically, debunked and disgraced him. And he was not allowed to continue his work of healing people non-toxically because A, that